Koe nui oje buen bungi wa windu munugug e pichi migwe chiwendaman and enimigwan bajayan. Wagosh indigu. I'll use English today too, but it is a language conference, so we really should start and try to hold up our language as much as we can. I'm so excited and honored to be in community with all of you, to be back here at Walpole again. And I'm really heartened to see the efforts that are ongoing, to hear the good words that got us started today. Coming from the young kids, I think I've been here several times, and I think it was the first time we were opened up by the kids. That was really good to see. I was heartened to hear the words of your chief talking about the importance of language and the connection between language and sovereignty. And MC, I thought, did a great job of framing what we've been dealing with historically, not just the negative stuff, but the positive things about what happens when we start bringing our language and culture back. And this room is full, and that says something too. I want to thank those of you who have been working in the school for your service to our young people. That is hard work, and we need you. And I think it's also heartening to see so many people from the community here. It is obvious that language and culture matter a lot to the people of Walpole, and that these kind of conversations can really help steer our efforts forward. I was sharing in my introduction, my native name is Wagosh, that means fox, and I come from the Eagle Clan. The community where I come from is Leech Lake, which is in Minnesota. And I was saying, I think it's kind of funny, we call Canada Jaganashiwaki, which is like English land. And the United States, Chimokomaniwaki, is like land of the big knives, like the Americans with their swords. And I was like, but it's all Anishinaabe-Waki. The Chimokoman doesn't own the United States any more than an Englishman owns Canada. And that we should think about how we frame and about things, because we are enculturated to absorb and forward colonial ways of thinking. And it's time to turn that stuff around. So my community's, I think it's about 800 miles away from here. It's all. And even when you look at Anishinaabe-Waki, it's well over 1,000 miles from one end to the other. It's a collection of interrelated dialect groupings rather than just one way of being, saying, and doing things. But at the same time, we are very connected, not just by blood, but also language and culture, this complex tapestry that we've inherited. And it is really great to be thinking about where we're going to go from here. I got a fairly short amount of time, so I'm going to share a few things that I've seen working and a little perspective about what matters as we get going. There's my introduction. Wagosh, Migizi. I didn't go through all of those. There's home, so Minnesota. Leech Lake's kind of in the northern part. There's a lot of Anishinaabe-Giwidi. I really, some of you from my previous visits here at Walpole, and I've seen some of you out at Anishinaabe in Teg. Maybe for those who haven't had a chance to bump into me before, I'll give a very brief orientation to my own journey. But I really want to spend most of my time talking about what's before us and how do we go forward. I'm a very candidate to be standing before you sharing anything about our language and culture. And that's not a performative humility statement, that's the truth. My father was born in Vienna, Austria, and spoke beautiful German. He's not Anishinaabe at all. He's actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant and survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He came to the United States at age 14, signed up for the US Army. World War II was still going. I think he wanted to kill Nazis. They sent him to the Pacific Theater. He's stationed in the Philippines. And eventually, he made his way to Minnesota. He met my mom, and here I am. But as a result of that, he spoke beautiful German, and he learned English and could sound like a native speaker of English. But he didn't have an Anishinaabe household or Anishinaabe culture to share with me. I shouldn't know anything. And in my mom's family, you're going to hear later today from a panel of folks wrestling with the history of residential boarding schools, which I think, especially in Canada, has been well documented. But it's good to think about how we metabolize that history and go forward. And my grandmother went to residential boarding school, and it's really her parents were the last generation where everybody spoke only Ojibwe. And my grandmother, who ended up going to residential school, was really raised in institutions and should not have had much to share in terms of language and culture. I mean, my grandmother, she made it out of the institutions and made it back to our home community and married a local boy and raised a family. I think some parts of our Anishinaabe culture were very much alive, in large part because everyone had so little money that if you did not pull your kids from school to go harvest wild rice for at least 2 weeks during ricing season, then you had trouble with feeding everybody. And if you didn't pull them for another 2 weeks for hunting, same problem. And with fishing and with maple production, that was 8 weeks out of school for my mom every year because all the kids had help with food production. So I think some parts of the culture were strong, but other things, like the natural intergenerational transmission of our language, were disrupted. Not everybody had the experience Helen Roy had, growing up immersed in our language and having that be the medium of the household and the community. So there too, I really shouldn't know anything about our language. And although I'll be the first to say I still have a lot to learn, I do know something. My mother had a really interesting journey of her own. I could spend the hour just telling you about some of the things that she did. She was born and raised and lived her first 18 years in our community. And you know, it's structured a little bit differently than with First Nations in Canada. So what they call a reservation in the United States actually encompasses for us over communities. So it's almost like, you know, a treaty area or that. But, you know, within that space, 10,000 enrolled tribals at Leech Lake, 10,000. So it's bigger than a lot of First Nations. And her entire childhood spent in a Native space. She only met one professional Native person ever, which meant out of 10,000 people, they couldn't find one of us to be the banker or the social worker or the teacher or the police officer. And it wasn't because none of us wanted a job like that. And it wasn't because none of us were capable of doing a job like that. It's because even in a Native space, even with sovereignty, the systems were that successful at excluding our people from gainful employment and upward mobility. Today, we are trying to change this, but we have inherited colonial systems and structures, and they're still going. It's part of the love-hate relationship that Anishinaabe people have with schools. On the one hand, there's the history, schools that kept cemeteries for kids and unmarked graves for kids. And now everyone wants us to love schools. And that doesn't always land right. Also, schools that very effectively worked to eradicate Indigenous languages and identities. And although we don't keep unmarked graves for kids at schools anymore, or at least I should hope not, the systems still center and do a good job of holding up English and even French, the colonial languages, and do a very poor job of supporting or centering. And so while we want education credentials and access to economic opportunity for our kids, we do not want to hold them under the waters of colonization until they have no idea who they are. We want education, but we don't want colonization, and it's hard to separate them. Although we can make steps, directions. My mom met one professional Native person her entire childhood, and that person was the school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. These are just pictures of my mom. They're different chapters of her life. And so she finished high school. She went to nursing school. She got a nursing degree. She came back to work for the health program in our community. And she thought, even here, we're getting pushed around. Enough of that. And she went back to school and got a law degree. She was the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. When I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court, and she'd say, you sit there and don't say a word. So I'd sit there, and I didn't say a word. And I can't remember her court cases very well, but I remember things. I remember that she was the only woman in court. I remember that she and her law partner, Paul Day, were the only Indigenous people in court. And I came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do in the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, role models. It matters. It's one of the secrets to having a strong language program in a school is who's going to be teaching language, somebody who knows the language, who's usually Indigenous. And it helps you address the D and the DEI in addition to all of the academic, linguistic, and cultural things. It matters. It matters for all the... My mom did her law degree in Washington, D.C., so there were a few years where we were going back and forth between our community and a big city, where I was going back and forth between being Anishinaabe and being the Indian. It was a perspective builder. There's some things that were actually positive about going in and out of a community, even though that was mainly when I was a little kid. I think experiencing a little bit of mixed company and cultural difference can be healthy. It's like going to the gym, and if you get to go to the gym a lot, you start getting stronger. But too much of it, if you spend a lot of your time code switching or code switched out, at some point code switching becomes assimilation and you can lose yourself in the process. We expect our kids to spend a lot of their time code switched. And by the way, with an educational system, everything you do when you get even two humans together in a room is a cultural decision. Sitting in chairs even is a cultural decision. Eating at a table, oh, the manito is here. But even the music you use in a school music program is a cultural decision. Having kids move from one class to another to the sound of a bell is a cultural decision. It's designed to enculturate people to be good, obedient factory workers who move from one shift to a break and back to work to the sound of a bell, even though we no longer have factory jobs to give them. Yeah, punch in, punch out, do your work, acquire debt, be a cog in them. And so for those who've had the inclination to say, I don't know why they want to spend time on crafts and culture, there's no value in that. Why is teaching the kids to move to the sound of a bell so valuable that we do it for 174 days a year, multiple times a day, but there's no value to culture, to connecting people to themselves, to having them and their community feel right about the learning happening in our space? It's because we've all been steeped in colonial operating systems and culture, and there are alternatives. Yes. The bells will go off. Don't go anywhere when that happens. Yeah, that doesn't mean smoke break. Right. So, my dad was life. My mom was trying to find a pathway out of poverty, and I saw big economic changes during that time too. When I was a little kid, we had a house with no electricity or running water, literally wash up in the creek, buy a gallon of milk, tie a string on it, sink it in the creek. It was spring-fed, kept it cool, pull on the string, and out came a gallon of top, pour it on your Cheerios, and away you go. I never felt economically disadvantaged. And here's a picture of me in Washington, D.C., going to first grade. Yeah, the picture's so ironic to me. For starters, I'm wearing a Washington Redskins t-shirt. Today, I'll be the first to say, do not use native imagery for sports teams and mascots, and I've got 1,000 reasons why, right? So it's very ironic. But I remember when this happened because my first grade teacher, prior to this picture, I was the only brown kid in my class. Everyone else was either white or black. And I was the only boy who had long hair. And it was a great novelty. And one day, the teacher decided to dress me like a girl in front of class, put barrettes in my hair, some makeup, and they had a good laugh. The teacher did that. Yep. I don't know why. Maybe because I come from a long line of ferocious warriors or whatever. I never told my parents what happened. I came home though, and I said, Ma, I want a haircut. I got one, and there it is, that 70s do. And I had toughed it out through college, or through first grade. And second grade, I had a black teacher, which was the only teacher in my entire educational journey who was not white. All the way through the K-12 system, through college, getting my master's degree, up to my PhD. And by the way, when we talk about things like white privilege, it's not economic advantage, it is the privilege of going to school, and I bet every white kid in Canada will get a white teacher at some point in their journey. They might get only white teachers every step of their journey. It's the privilege of having your histories widely represented in the curriculum, to have your culture be the culture by which you operate the school, and those cultural norms and expectations being the one to which our kids are told to aspire. It is having your group be the definition of success. And if you are Anishinaabe, you are not guaranteed such things. That doesn't mean we've made no progress, but progress is slow and it's often a fight. Out of the TRC's nearly 100 action items, I mean, we've gotten 3 done. A fight to get like healthy water in our communities, less all the other things. It's maddening. How are we supposed to believe that all of those systems are so good for us? That everyone has our best interests at heart? It's hard to believe that. My 2nd grade teacher, though, treated me like a normal human being, and it was such a relief. She was left-handed. I tried to write lefty, even though I'm right-handed. 3rd grade, from then on, always white teachers, and I froze like a deer in the headlights. I was like, oh, God, here it comes again. So for a skinny little native kid, I put on the best stoic Indian you could imagine. They said, "What is your name?" And I just fold my arms and go, I say, "Oh, why don't you come to the principal and tell him about that?" "What's your name, kid?" Man, I kept it up for weeks. Very stubborn, like amazingly stubborn. And eventually they had me assessed with disabilities, behavior disabilities, and they couldn't break through, and they said, "We're gonna have to send him to a special school." And I'm thinking, yes, I'm out of here. Makes you wonder about the assessments, the decisions, everything. And then they also said, you know, when they were saying, kind of imagining my mom's potential, I get kicked out of school. And my mom could be pretty fierce, and I thought this might not go so well at home. So when they asked, did they speak other languages at home other than English, I finally spoke, and I said, "Oh, Dad speaks German, Mom speaks Anishinaabe. They're like, "Oh, that's the problem." And they brought my parents into a conference, which I wish we had a recording of. It was mainly school officials speaking really loudly and really slowly. "Hello, we need to speak to you about your son." You know, and my parents are looking at it, they're like, "What?" You know, I don't know what said. I'm sure it was snarky and snippy. "I'm sorry, sir, could you distill the salient parts of your communication that doesn't make any sense to us at all?" They're like, "They speak English. Was that English? I don't know." She also turned and gave me the native Mother Godzilla laser vision death stare. Started to speak. Some of you may have seen that look. That was 3 years of behavior change off of 1 day. A lot of our kids have a day. It's not the same as my day, but they have days nonetheless. A lot of times, it's not just the macroaggression or the microaggression. It is the absent narratives that are screaming at our kids. You and yours are not important, not worthwhile, and not deserving of our attention in this educational space. And the absent narratives feel like the continuation of an age-old assault on our very way of being. And when people feel assaulted, you get predictable responses. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Truancy is a flight response. Discipline issues is a fight response. Native kids talking to each other in the cafeteria and not everybody else is a freeze response. Or hanging out at the Anishinaabe language and culture teacher's room to the exclusion of other spaces. No, it's humans. Humans are complex. Nothing's quite that simple. But these are dimensions that affect the work. So as this community, and I've been here, coming here off and on long enough to know, sometimes there's an effort to get things going on language and culture, and sometimes there's an effort to push back and diminish that. But keep it framed and think about the long term and who we're really all about. What do our kids need? And you'll start to see things a little differently. So at the same time that I had this experience and it affected me, somehow deep down inside, I still knew that being Anishinaabe was a good thing. And I didn't have a way to say it when I was 6 years old. And I had just got my hair cut, which is one of the visible markers of identity. All I could find was an old Washington Redskins t-shirt, so I put it on. And it might be a little hard to see, but I'm wearing a cape here. This bandana was super niche. I'll come back to the kid in a few minutes. We are hard on ourselves, and we are so hard on our own people. I have seen young people criticizing our elders. They never taught me anything. I've heard elders criticizing young people. They don't want to learn anything. They don't care. I've heard people stepping forward to do stuff in language, saying they're not doing it right, it's a joke, and it should be like this. Come on. Our time on this planet is so short, even if you get 100 years. Our energy is so sacred. If we spend our finite time and sacred energy throwing one another out of the canoe, there will be no one left to paddle, and that canoe will go nowhere. In many ways, it's an insecurity and a defense mechanism to be so hard on each other. Because if it's someone else's fault, that means I'm off the hook. Our elders have done and continue to do the very best that they can. And what they have done and continue to do is a lot, and it is enough. Our young people do care. You heard them this morning. They are learning a lot. They are doing a lot. Our communities are already in their hands. Hate and anger will never drive out the darkness. Only the light can do that. So to get us started, this is kind of a cultural frame that it's not like we have souls, it's like we are souls. We have but a little while. We're not humans looking for a spiritual experience. We are spirits, and we are having a temporary human experience. You are the one your ancestors were waiting for and praying for through the generations. You've been given a unique set of gifts, and you yourself are a gift to the world. When we start there, it's so much easier to get started. I ended up finishing high school with a plan that a lot of young people come up with. I'm going to get out of town and never come back. I finished college with a plan to come home and never leave. And in the long run, that's kind of what I did. I ended up connecting with this guy, the late Archie Mose, who was an important spiritual leader in our area. He was born in 1901. He was 12 years old the first time he ever saw a white man. That was an American experience. He was in his 30s the first time he saw a black man or a car. When I went to see him, he was in a little modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. And I was stumbling and bumbling. I knew to bring him a sema and some gifts. And he shut off the TV and he said, "Oh, I've been waiting for you." I was like, "Waiting for me? How could you be waiting for me? You don't even know who I am." But he'd had a dream. I looked like this person in his dream, and for him that was enough. He said, "Just sleep on the couch." So I slept on the couch, and at about 5 in the morning, he's standing over the couch. "Get up. You got to drive me to a funeral." I was like, "Funeral? Who died? What's going on?" I kind of became his gopher, like go for that. I pipe, bring that drum, drive me here, drive me there. And that's all I ever wanted. I was so excited just to be in a room. There's more to say about my time and journey with him, but as it progressed, what I had, he could speak some English that well. And so he just operated in Anishinaabe Mawin, and I had a chance to really swim in our language, and it really made a big transformational difference. I feel like healing can take many forms, and all of the things matter and contribute. We're dealing with an epidemic in our communities with regard to substance abuse, with mental health, with suicide, with so many things. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Language and culture is connection. It's connection to our ancestors, across generations, to our future generations, and that is genuinely healing. When somebody finds genuine connection, like if somebody, for example, was dealing with alcohol addiction, they can heal to the point where they can walk into a bar and order a burger and not fall off the wagon. If they are connected to themselves, to their higher power, to the person sitting next to them, or whatever it happens to be. Telling our people to be something that they are not and never will be, to be a good Jaganash, will never deliver connection the way our language and culture can and does. I ran with Archie Mose as long as he lived. You know, some things are different even though some things are very much the same. One of the things that's different is we have some communities where no one has ever been baptized and Christianity was not a thing. That is uncommon in this part of Anishinaabe country. And so he was from one of those communities, 100% traditional Ojibwe religious practice, funerals, everything. And so one of the things that they have, when somebody's passed away a year later, they have a ceremony to bring the family out of mourning, and they do it at the ceremonial drums. And I was going over there, and I remember thinking, you know, Archie did all of the ceremonial drum in that community, and I remember thinking, I don't even know who's going to talk. And when I went there, one of the daughters was greeting me. Her name was Betsy, and she was so sweet to me. She'd always kiss me on each cheek, give me a big hug every time I saw her. I think as much as anything, she loved me for the way I loved her dad. And she also had like the dark glasses, and the cane could give the mean native grandma look, and her grandkids would just, you know, she'd rattle that cane and take off running. But so she could be strict too, and for the first time in my life, she was looking at me like I was one of the grandkids. And she said, I bet you wonder who's going to talk today. I said, yeah, who's going to do that? And she said, well, you are. I said, what? I said, I'm still a kid. I'm in my 20s, and I'm not even from this community. And she said, well, you've been following that old man around all these years. I'm going to find out what you learned. And so she had tobacco, and she had a line of people, because there's another custom where people bring bowls of food to the ceremonial drums for special requests, healings, and prayers and stuff. And so I literally had pouches of tobacco between each set of fingers and in both hands. Looked kind of crazy. And she said, by the way, he never forgot a native name, and he never forgot what they were asking for. I'll be listening. That was my first public speaking event in any language. Yeah. So I got up there and bumbled and rumbled my way through that. When I was done, I dared one glance at her, and she just gave me a little nod, and that was that. It was kind of like Forrest Gump after he realized he could run. After that, every time he went somewhere, he was running, and he never thought it would take him anywhere, but it did. It was kind of like that for me. I wasn't trying to do or be anything. I was just wanting to be in the room and to learn. But it ended up giving me a lifelong mission and work. And eventually I did have to get a job and go for more, actively study things like our history and language. But really that's how it all got started for me. I remember becoming a parent too, which is so terrifying, being a parent, right? Because there's one job: do not mess your kid up. But you don't get any do-overs. And we are all so imperfectly human. And we cannot control the environment around us. So it's scary being a parent. It really is. And I remember thinking, how do I give my kid a language when this just hasn't been done in this community in so long? And everybody's looking, hoping a tribal government or a school can fix everything, you know? And I just said, well, I'm gonna try to do what Archie was doing with me and just use our language as much as I can. And I remember at one point, she's maybe 2 years old, my daughter, Gijugukwe, and she wakes up crying in the middle of the night, and she's crying around for milk, and I'm thinking, yes, it's working, it's working. I remember I've been to Anishinaabe Tag most of the years since the very beginning, and I think it was maybe the first or second year I was giving a talk there, and she was maybe 4 years old, running in circles around me and around the podium. Finally, her little voice catches on the mic, Hingy booged. She's like, I farted. Yeah, they love that. Then you could hear anything else I had to say, but they were all talking. You hear that little kid? She's speaking in Anishinaabe, and something's happening. This is good. We got to keep going. It's like, oh man, I should have given Mike to begin with. I think Rita was there. And so I stayed with it. Today she's turning 30 this year. She's been working with elders, recording and transcribing stories. She teaches Anishinaabe, and what I came to learn is that it is actually possible to restore the intergenerational transmission of our language in the home. The Hawaiians, by the way, who are a great inspiration to us, when they started language revitalization efforts there, their language was illegal in the state of Hawaii, and there were only 1,000 speakers left. Half of them in one isolated island community, and the other half were elders over 70. Wasn't looking great. And they got going, and when they did, some pretty amazing things started to happen. Today, there are 24,000 speakers of Hawaiian, and 3,000 have learned it as their first language in the home. So they tripled the population of first speakers who learned it as their first language in the home. And they multiplied 24-fold the entire population of speakers, which is pretty cool. It can be done, and it doesn't just happen because we want it to or because it should. They had to do stuff. There's my crew. We have 9 kids. Some of them are married. We're in the grandbaby business. I like this Abigail Echohawk quote. She said, "We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved, I'm institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient." We are not disadvantaged by our elders. We are not disadvantaged by our communities. We've been disadvantaged by colonial systems and structures. That's the difference. So who's going to have our back now? Colonial systems and structures, or our ancestors, elders, parents, kids, and future generations? None of this stuff is easy. Kind of a famous drawing. Learning a language, not easy. Building it up to revitalize it at scale in a community, that's also not easy. The easy stuff is this line right here. That's going to the party. That's waiting for a treaty settlement to solve all your problems. And all of that stuff makes for a much harder climb out. The harder climb is doing the things right now. But if you do the things right now, it does make things very different down the road. By the way, that's a good analogy for just about everything. It's easier to spend your money now. It is hard to save 10 cents out of every dollar. But if you do, there you are, playing golf or whatever, full-time native. And if you don't, that's tougher. It's like that with our language, with our culture, with all the things. No one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. There will be limitations to what the systems will provide. That doesn't mean there's nothing we can use within the systems. And herein lies a paradox. If we lived only as we did in 1491, we would die. Because the world is not the world that was there in 1491. Because there's no way to live as we did in 1491 and throw all of the other people and all of their stuff and chemicals and pollution and big cities out of the space. We have to navigate all the crap, right? And so we have to be realistic about where we are and how do we move forward. The tools that each generation needs will be different from the ones that the previous one needed and different from the ones that future ones need. And at the same time, we still need everything they had in 1491 because it will pay dividends in so many different ways. Another way to think about that is colonization has been about erasure, taking one language, culture, and religion and using it to supplant others and build something right on top of them. And it's used so much violence to do that. But when you solve your problems with violence, it makes a lot of other problems. Now, why would we think that all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? And they cannot. And deeply embedded in our own languages and cultures are some very different ways of looking at the world and solving problems. We need that. At the same time, even the Amish struggle to go Amish. It's not just because they lose people every year. It's because if they don't pay their taxes, the US or Canadian government or the municipal governments there will take their farms. They have to navigate the systems that are there. So even when we have these language revitalization, culture revitalization meetings and somebody comes over there and says, I don't know why they're writing it down. We never used to write things down, you know? And I'm like, did you hear in a car to register that complaint? Why are some of these modern things okay and some are not? But ultimately, if there's going to be an Xbox in the home and a TV in the home, then those things should be speaking our language, or it will go. So all the things can matter. There's more to say about what the Hawaiians have done and how they have gone about doing it, but they have a very strong culture-based approach. And the language has shifted a little bit. You know, immersion sometimes means different things to people. I've seen a lot of programs that we're calling an immersion program, but it's really a language enrichment program. Immersion was originally designed to mean using target language, Anishinaabe, as the language of instruction. So Hawaiians are usually calling in English their schools Hawaiian medium schools, where Hawaiian is the language of instruction. There's so many things you need to make that fly, including teachers who are great fluent speakers, who can deliver the goods, all kinds of things. So, you know, among the things we're trying to, I work at Bemidji State University. We are building an Ojibwe teacher training program so we can certify, credential, and deliver a high level of fluency to future teachers of our language. And we need that in multiple places in multiple ways. It's part of the story. Ojibwe medium schools have been popping up in different places in both the United States and in Canada. You know, there are 600,000 Anishinaabe on the planet of us. That's a lot. But we're scattered across 141 First Nations in Canada and multiple communities in the US side of the border too. So it's hard to save everyone everywhere all at once. But there are pockets of strength and there are things we can learn from one another. That's Rose Tainter saying we want an Anishinaabe medium school like those Hawaiians got, and they got one. Wadukadading's been going for 25 years in a row. That's a long track record. They have graduates who are getting teaching degrees and coming back to work at the school. That doesn't mean they've solved all the problems. If you want a little more, and I'm not going to spend as much time, but maybe when we get to questions and answers and things like that, we can talk a little more about some of the Ojibwe medium schools and how they're going about it. You could check out this free video, which kind of profiles a couple of the Ojibwe medium schools in the States and how they've gone about doing things. I don't think a linear approach makes sense. You got to do this, then you can do that, then you can do the other thing. I think you can start in any number of places, and a lot of them have merit. Even changing the road signs, we've been working on changing the signs in the hospitals, public schools, regional event center. We got it on the cop cars, the adjacent non-native community. There it is, Gunawanjagang, Minawa, Nadamagang, to protect and serve. Doesn't fix all the big problems, but it normalizes our language and it says, I see you. There are so many things. The Cherokee are really interesting. In Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation, and by the way, this may be a sidebar, we don't have to get into it now, but there's a lot of identity politics going on in First Nations and in the border. Who's native, who decides, pretendian takedowns, all that kind of stuff. You know? Some places are disenrolling their members. A lot of it's about political power and money too. 1/3 of our people have been adopted and fostered out of our communities. 1 out of 3. It wasn't just during the 60s scoop, it was going on long before then and continues to go on today. And when it's a big, nasty viper's pit about who has a right to be here, it's very discouraging for those who have been disconnected through no fault of their own. Across First Nations in Canada, approximately 70% live off reserve. And here, you're in the middle of a collection of like white farms, industrial complex, and pretty close big metropolitan areas. I bet your data set here is pretty close. So if we are again throwing our own people out of the canoe, and it feels like you're gonna get your head bit off if you poke your head back into the language conference, then people won't do it. So you have to think about the tone and the deliverables. The Cherokee Nation opened up tribal membership to anyone who could prove lineal descent from an original member. They have 466,000 enrolled Cherokee tribal members. Hole. It also means everybody running for office in Oklahoma pays a visit to beg for votes at Cherokee Nation. Some of the funding allocations are on a per capita basis. So the annual budget for Cherokee Nation is $1 billion with a B, which means they can sequester $17 million, and that's in US funds, real money for now. Yeah, someday it'll be Bitcoin, oh my God. I got out of there, hopefully they'll let me back too. But that $17 million every year is sequestered for their language. They have an adult immersion program where they take 12 new students a year who are paired up with 12 first speakers of the language. They spend 40 hours a week and make a 2-year commitment. All of the students and all of the speakers are paid a living wage, health insurance, which matters in the US, and a 401k. And at the end of the 2-year commitment, they will guarantee that they can speak Cherokee at what's called the advanced low level, which is a high level of fluency. They won't need English for anything that they're doing. They pay them a lot of money, and they do cohort every 6 months. They've been going for a while now, so every 6 months, there are a dozen new fluent speakers of their language in their community, every 6 months. Now, I was out at the Huron-Robinson Treaty Settlement. It was a $10 billion payment. That's a lot of money. And a lot of people were saying, give me my check, and hurry it up, you know? And I said, what would you do if you sequestered payment for language. Because a generation from now, no one's even going to remember that grandma got a nice truck. But if you are putting a dozen fluent speakers into your community every 6 months, 10 years from now, you will remember that. You will know that, and you will feel that. What's it worth to you? Now, the Canadian system, it's just an emerging effort. That's one treaty settlement in Anishinaabe country. There will be others. And there will be other pushes for restorative justice action and funding that will flow, hopefully, to First Nation governments to be the arbiters of what matters. So what matters? And I think our language should matter. I think the positive identity development of our kids should matter, because that is connected to fighting the suicide rate and the substance abuse issues and people coming back to our communities. So many things. There are many things that can be done, and that it's like, first you have to do, the immersion school. Then you can do the adult immersion. Wherever you want to start is awesome. Wherever you've got leadership, impetus, and will, all of the contributions matter. Mille Lacs, which is the neighboring community to me where I live in, and they're actually in central Minnesota, they're a really successful gaming tribe. And things are different on the US side. For the most part, it's like figure it out on your own has been the attitude of the US government, which has certain benefits and drawbacks. But there's also a legal status for sovereignty that is different. So like even if where I live in the state of Minnesota, there's legal permission for gaming or gambling, but tribes are not beholden to state laws with regard to anything in civil jurisdiction. So regardless of what the state laws say, a sovereign nation can build a casino. That's why you see them all over the place in the US. That's a legal and structural thing, probably a bigger conversation we have time for. Yeah. But 5, oh my God. All right, I'll sit up. But this story might be helpful for you to see. So they have money. And by the way, they saved their money from the very beginning of the very first casino. Today, their endowment produces more money than their casinos. Another thing worth considering if there's an infusion of capital to your community. And I came to a meeting and they said, we have monies for workforce development and we want to indigenize this whole thing. And at that point, they had identified 25 remaining fluent first speakers of their language, all over 70. I said, you're probably not going to send them all back to college and have them run a new immersion school. Doesn't sound realistic. And so I pitched other ideas. I said, let's build Rosetta Stone for our language. Let's build books for a literacy initiative in our language. And I pitched all these ideas. They looked around at each other and they said, well, let's do all of it. Great meeting. And we got to work. We had a team of 50 people working on Rosetta Stone. For those of you who don't know, Rosetta Stone is kind of like Babbel or Duolingo. It's a language learning application. Can push to an app on your phone or computer. Uses audio, video, AI, all kinds of stuff. And we have seriously going to permit a non-native corporation to profiteer off of our attempted colonization. A lot of people have sensitivities about copyright ownership and money, right? And so we worked out a contract that said the tribe will retain all copyrights. They made it free for all the tribal members. And they just paid the company for a service for help application and doing video capture. They also set it up in a way so that they would hire their own people to be the videographers, photographers, curriculum developers, and basically taught an army of 50 people how to develop curriculum, do world-class videography, and there are people with those skills now in that community. Lots more to say about the mechanics for how they did that. We also put in punitive escape clauses because it would take several years to build this, and there's an election cycle every 2 years. And so what happens if the new crew says, why are they spending so much money on that, and wants to pull the plug? So we put in punitive escape clauses so no one could claw the money back out. All of the things that came up were anticipated. It did happen. Somebody did try to claw the money out and they couldn't. They were paid directly out of the contracted funds. And the work continued. There's Brenda Moose. We're doing Ojibwe spell check. We're putting up scripts for the kids' books. We had another team of 50 people working on the books. And by the way, here's John Nichols. He's a non-native linguist. There's some advice on how to use linguists and not get used by linguists. Spiritual leader Lee Staples, Ojibwe student, now professor at Le Coudray University, some of the books, more to say on Rosetta Stone, some of the elders getting their books, Elfrida looking at hers, realizing that she's a published author and she's crying happy tears. And I will wrap this up pretty quickly here for you. So back to our Jedi Council, we had to work through the pandemic, which meant sending a grandchild and a computer to every elder's home. And I remember one time calling Carol Nickerboy, and I was like, hey, we have our work session. Oh, tagish wago shingi winena easy kamba biza kawaga na tagi wigami going into ja. And I was like, it's time for our work session. She says, well, I already got my coat on. I'm going to the casino. I said, casino? There's a pandemic. You're supposed to stay home and be safe. She goes, oh, tagish. The language is more important. She takes her coat off. We worked for a few hours, and she goes, well, I'm going to the casino now because my niece has been waiting in the car the whole time. Middle of the winter, you know, which also meant the niece did not come in to see if everything's okay. But they were so dedicated. 6 out of those 25 fluent speakers in that community passed away during the pandemic. That was 20% of the fluent speakers there. It was no joke. When we finally came out of the pandemic, we're able to celebrate Rosetta Stone, the books. We asked Joe Naquinaby to speak. He's on the left here with the buzz cut. And he said, you know, we've been through a lot. We've been out the past few. I have to say, seeing all of these young people coming around, seeing what we've been able to build, knowing that our elders will be teaching people our language for hundreds of years to come, I have to say that this has been the happiest time of my life. And it was a reminder that when you get real about this stuff, there is healing for your elders. There is healing for your young people. And there are tools that pay lasting value for generations to come. By the way, the government in Mille Lacs, starfish and coffee. Yeah. And the government in Mille Lacs can then say, we hire many people to work for us. We expect all of them to achieve this level of competency in our language. Here is the tool to do it. The assessments are built right in. You have 1 year from date of hire. Welcome to our sovereign nation. And so language revitalization is not just about another pretty bird in the forest. It's about sovereignty. All right, so I better wrap things up. Knock it off, she said. All right, so there are many, many other things to see. We got Star Wars out, and we got all kinds of cool stuff. And maybe I'll share this with you. I've heard people say we live in two worlds. It's okay to be good at that world, be good at this one too. But in my view, I'll offer you something a little different. It's one world. It's one world. When we have a Jaganash come to Walpole Island, they don't have to abandon their whiteness or English language to come hang out with us or to be treated well, right? Why should we have to abandon our Anishinaabe Mawin, Anishinaabe Ananda Mawin, to be successful in the rest of the world? We don't have to do that. We don't have to code switch to keep the dual consciousness. We can be exactly who we are, exactly who the Creator wanted us to be, and thrive. So to this kid, my wounded inner child, I carry him with me everywhere I go. It took me a while to figure out some adulting that he has to go in the back seat, safely buckled up, and I don't give him the wheel. But he does come with me everywhere I go. And I can see what hurt him, but I can see how much he knew. He knew that being Anishinaabe was a good thing. He was wise beyond his years. I love him for that. I see so many of our people who think the same way. Here's our family property. I feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. It looked a little more like the fields on my drive-in from Chatham this morning when my parents first got started. That's my dad on a tractor with my brother. And they planted trees until they planted all of the trees in this picture here. It's over 1 million trees planted. They had a child labor force. And a lot of us look around at the problems, climate change, race relations, politics, especially in the US, language and culture under extreme threat and stress. We're right where we should be, having been through all the crap our people have been through. We are not less than, but we do have decisions to make. Changing this stuff is not like moving this mountain of problems that's been built for hundreds of years, thousands. It's planting the seeds, and it can change everything. And that is the work. You've been doing that work here. It might not feel like it every day, but you have been planting the seeds for community support, for the involvement of your educational system. And it's time to take it to the next level. The work can feel heartbreaking and isolating for anyone at any level of it, you can feel like the lone tree out there, battered by the wind, but you're not alone. There's a room full of people who care. There are elders here who care and support, and young people who want to learn. And you can do something meaningful with that.